Claymore mines and turn them around and then move back and make little noises, and our guys would set off the mines and injure themselves. Other things, the cavalry units use something called armored personnel carriers. And inside those armored personnel carriers, there were phosphorus grenades. And these carriers were very, very light, so if they went over a mine, it would cause the grenades, the phosphorus grenades to explode, and our guys got awful, awful burns. It made them look like caricatures, cartoon caricatures. Let's see. When we first got there in November, the hospital wasn't quite complete, so our chief nurse had us be invited to various parties, and in doing so she exchanged us for lumber, paint, any supplies she could get. And but we did have a nice time at the party. Our hospital was made of Quonset buildings. They were like oval twin, tin, made out of tin. And the only wards that were air conditioned were the emergency room, the operating room, and the intensive care units and the recovery room. During the first 6 months we were there, we had no sidewalks and we had no overhead covering. So that my friend Connie, who was across the way in the recovery room, when she came time to send me patients from the recovery room, during the monsoon season, she would say, "I'm sending you 2 patients after the rain lets up." Well, once we got the sidewalks and the overhead covering in, then we didn't have to wait until the rain let up. Some of the types of wounds we saw were burns, as I said, chest wounds, abdominal wounds, amputations, multiple fragment wounds. Fragments were the results of bombs exploding, and pieces of metal would fly and get underneath the patient's skin, and sometimes deeper. The types of treatments we used were penicillin, tetracycline, streptomycin, and we did something called delayed primary closures, which meant that we did not close up these fragment wounds. We cleaned them, debrided them, and then we sent them back to the States so that they would be closed up there. We endured mortar attacks. We watched the B-52s during the daytime, and at nighttime we'd see helicopter firefights. We were mortared about 4 times, and it was a scary year, but it was a very rewarding year. Thank you.
All right, now we'll open to questions. If you have any questions, raise your hand, and don't be afraid. That's why you're here. Come on. Must be somebody with some questions. Yes, sir.
Did any of you experience like Agent Orange?
Did any of you experience Agent Orange?
I was exposed to Agent Orange. I have type 2 diabetes, and and I had a heart attack in 1998.
I was active in the Vietnam Veterans of America in this area years ago. In fact, I was one of the original founders. I wound up being the Agent Orange coordinator from Manhattan up to Montreal. We were all exposed to Agent Orange, especially Central Highland people. One of my best memories of Vietnam was the water in the mountains. That when you'd fill your canteens from these mountain streams, and I don't know what I've been drinking my whole life, but it wasn't water compared to what this was. And then to find out that it was contaminated with Agent Orange, just kind of put the icing on that nasty cake. The VA denied it forever and ever and ever. In fact, that's why one of the reasons VBA formed. If you went to the VA back in the late 70s, early 80s, complaining about ailments, you were shuffled off to the psychiatric floor. They did not want to deal with it. I did interviews of hundreds and hundreds of people. A lot of them are now dead. Birth deformities like you wouldn't believe. Took a lot of years, but now the VA does finally acknowledge some of it. And they will slip some of your ailments into the Agent Orange category. I'm pre-diabetic. I've already had 2 heart attacks. I don't know if that's attributable to Agent Orange. They say it's attributable to Vietnam. I think it's more attributable to the VA. Stress dealing with them. But it was nasty, nasty stuff. Sprayed over 20 million gallons of, it wasn't just Agent Orange, it was Agent Blue, Agent White. It was defoliation. One of my last nights in the field, we came on this little knoll, and we had heard about defoliation. Some of us had probably heard of it, couldn't pronounce it. I still don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. But you got people shooting at you, stuff that they're spraying. How bad can that be? But we were on this little knoll of a hill, and it was devastated. It looked like something that had been leveled through massive firepower. And what it came to realize it probably was, it had just been sprayed. Within hours, everybody was sick. Everybody was thrown up. Everybody was. A helicopter came in for resupply. I radar O'Reilly'd myself and the machine gunner. I was the assistant gunner at the time. We went back on the helicopter, and I thought, if you were willing to do it, you could get away with just about anything in the Army. They just cared that the papers, that the dots were signed, and it was, what permeates society now is a CYA mentality. You get a little rowdy here, a cover your ass mentality, and it's everywhere. It's everywhere, and that's what really, as long as you were covered and you weren't left out to dry, nobody much cared. So,
okay, is there anyone else that wants to respond?
Yeah,
Matt?
got that.
I'm sorry, let Matt, and then you can.
Yeah. I don't know if Pat answered your question what Agent Orange is, but Agent Orange was the chemical that was sprayed. The results of that spraying is what you're probably asking, and there's a lot of conditions. The person responsible for okaying the spraying of Agent Orange in Vietnam by the name of Admiral Zumwalt. And over the years, it was an unnecessary thing to do at the time, but the result of it was not. And Adam Zumwalt's own son died from Agent Orange exposure. So that it's an issue.
Is there anyone else who was there that wants to?
This is probably not the forum to do this, but I'd like to rebut this gentleman's statement here a couple of minutes ago, because I would hate very much for you young people to walk out of this building to believe 2 things that were stated here. And that is that 1, the Army does not care. That's wrong. That's wrong. The Army does care. The military establishment does care. You heard the other discourses here. We do care for our people. We care for them very, very much. because the very basis of what we do and what we try to accomplish in the military establishment is predicated on the human beings that we have serving that. So you do care. Secondly, the VA has come a long ways. And I like to put a plug in for what the VA does these days in
Would you
support of the
explain what the
veterans.
VA is?
That's all I'm saying.
Okay, what is the VA?
The VA is the Veterans Administration. Pardon me.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to say that also I was diagnosed with PTSD and
What is that?
post-traumatic stress syndrome. And without the VA and the Vet Center in Albany, New York, well, Kate Regan saved my life. Let's put it that way. And for which I am very, very grateful. And I did receive a lot of support. And maybe it was because, you know, I waited about 20 years before all this came out.
We founded the Vet Center. You know, let me correct something here. The VA is doing a much better job than they did. The only reason they're doing is because people like myself, Ned Foote, Joe Policino, held them to task and made them perform. We fought tooth and nail to get this Vet Center, and nobody can say any different in this area, and it has done a lot of good, in spite of the VA and the mentality that they carried here. And it wasn't just here, it was all over the country. And you know, believe what you want, sir, but the VA is only doing it because veterans stood up and said, you gotta do it. They didn't do it on their own.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes, sir.
Should the U.S. have involved itself in Vietnam?
No, never.
Then why don't we go through everyone?
Question.
Okay, should the United States have been involved in Vietnam, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's interesting because the National Security Agency just declassified about 8,000 pages of the original intercept of the incident that supposedly started the Vietnam War,
The Gulf of Tonkin.
the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And it turned out it was one
Maybe
of,
if someone wants to explain that to the students, what it is, what it was, the Gulf.
well, supposedly an American ship, the USS Maddox, I think it was supposedly fired upon by 3 North Vietnamese gunboats. This happened in the Gulf of Tonkin, supposedly in international waters. This was, what, 1963, I believe? or
August 64.
64. And there was a lot of, you know, about whether it actually happened or not. Well, the NSA just declassified all these documents, and I spent I don't know how many hours going through these documents online. And from what I understand about it is nobody really knows whether this incident happened or not. And there were some misunderstandings about what was actually copied. The units that copied the intercept from it were units from the outfit I was in. They were stationed in Subic Bay in the Philippines, because we had no intercept in Vietnam at the time. So this came out of the Philippines and out of Japan. And it's very sketchy. If you read this intercept, some of it is still classified because they blotted out some of the stuff. I was very surprised. But a lot of it is out in the open now. And according to this, in all honesty, I don't think it should have happened.
Okay, anyone else want to respond? How do you personally feel?
Personally, we did have a purpose. There is a book, a gentleman by the name of Michael Lind, who, for probably the first book I've read about this era, has come out with a book, Vietnam, the Necessary War. In that book, he promotes the concept of the context of the time. They're talking about the domino effect, communism expansion. This is the second war of the Cold War, where it got hot. Korea was the first one. We basically ended up with a stalemate at truce. There's still problems in Korea. The second major influence was in Vietnam, an extension of the North Vietnamese with Russian and Chinese assistance, and Warsaw Pact. And then the third conflict of the Cold War was the original conflict in Afghanistan between the, quote, freedom fighters, Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet troops that invaded. In all three wars, the two parties of the Cold War are looking for proxies, other countries to heat up and create a situation that the others have to pour in money and blood. We were part of the blood parlor. Most of us, or some of us, were willing. We did hear President Kennedy saying that we would bear any burden, pay any price, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And Kennedy, for all his good and bad portions, he was a dramatic speaker, particularly to a young group of people who founded or were the first recruits for the Peace Corps and the Green Berets and others of a generation that went out to participate as, quote, young crusaders in the Cold War. So Vietnam, The Necessary War by Michael Lind, he scathes all parties. Nobody is unscathed. You're looking for a fair document to read, a book, he covers most of the periods. And he doesn't take any prisoners in his opinions. But he puts it in the context of what it was in a world political situation.
Is there anyone else?
Yeah, I would just like to say, as painful as that war was, and I lost friends as well as the other people here lost friends in that war. What would have happened had we not gotten involved in Korea and in Vietnam? What would the world look like today? I think if we had won that war easily, we'd have a different discussion today. But we didn't. It was a difficult war and we were not well prepared to it. We spilled our blood. 58,000 people died. We have to ask, was that worth it? I'm a clergy person and I'm dedicated to peace, but I also know that there are times when armed conflict is the last resort. I believe those who prosecuted the war in Vietnam did what they thought was the right thing to do. And I think we did contain communism. The world would be different today if we had not spilled our blood there.
First thing I want to say before I tell you my opinion on the war. First, I want to thank the lady at the end of the table. Anytime I run into a nurse, military nurse, I'd like to thank her for saving my life. The war in Vietnam, I gave a lot for my country in Vietnam, and a good part of my body was left in Vietnam. Maybe at the beginning of Vietnam, yeah, it probably had a mission and we probably should have been there. I heard the same thing not long ago in talking about Iraq or Afghanistan, same type of thing, should we be there? Over the years, as the Vietnam War became more and more political, and the politicians put handcuffs on the military people, and basically we no longer had a mission. All we had was to survive our 1 year of service in Vietnam. And there was never a clear-cut mission. Probably should have got out of there, but we got in so deep we didn't know how to get out of there, and we lost 58,000 young men and women to that war, and it's still an open question. Was it worth it? I don't know.
Would any of you gentlemen like to comment at all?
John.
Sir?
Can I say a couple words, please?
Sure.
To the student, you know how many people live, the population of Vietnam is? Anybody have a guess? There's 82,000 people that live in Vietnam.
Million.
82 million, sorry, you're correct. The area of this country is about the size of the state of New Mexico. This is a very crowded country. It's one of the poorest on earth, especially in the 1960s. 95% of the people in Vietnam in the 1960s had never used a stove, refrigerator, any of these things. Very few of them had ever seen a TV he said. It's a very, very poor country that we got involved in. I consider myself a veteran of the war, but also a student of it. All right? The point I'm trying to make here today is that when I first got there, I realized, number one, we picked the wrong side. 95% of the South Vietnamese people did not want to prosecute a war. They were farmers. They were peasants. This is a country also that had fought the Japanese, had fought the French, and had won. An interesting book to read is GIAP, G-I-A-P. It's written by Peter MacDonald, who's an Englishman. This is the general officer that defeated the French and outweighed the Americans. If you take anything away from here today, understand that this was a very, very poor country. I spent an awful lot of time with the Montagnards. These are the mountain people. There were about 500,000 of them in Vietnam. They look totally different. They're similar to African Americans. They have different texture hair, different color. These people we respected because they were fighters. The other thing that you didn't mention is the disease in this country. Malaria, dysentery, the casualties we took from diseases alone. The Montagnards suffered from polio, tuberculosis. All right, there's a lot more to just shooting and being shot at when you go into an environment like that. One of the biggest failings we have is we didn't understand the people, didn't understand the mission. We got lost somewhere in the shuffle. But I sincerely hope that you take some time and study the history of this war, because there's a lot to be learned. The other thing I would point out to you, I'm a graduate of SUNY Albany, liberal arts, SUNY Brockport, public administration. Best schools I ever attended were in the military, without fail. The one thing the military can do is train you. Some of the greatest schools in this country are run by the military. With that, I wish you all the luck in the world. Question? We picked the wrong side. The war was fought between the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese had a reason to win. The South Vietnamese, I'm not sure they really did. When you had the senior officer, General Westmoreland, say that the ARVNs, the Republic of Vietnam Army, the South Vietnamese Army, he said 80% of its combat ineffective. What did that do to the morale of the South Vietnamese? What did it say to me? We're not on the right side, folks. Nothing personal. Yes.
I just want to add something. Since I've had the opportunity to go back to Vietnam recently, my host over there, a fellow by the name of Howe, who was originally from Hanoi, he's from the north, and I was the first American that he had ever met. And he came over to me and he said, after a week of taking us around, he said to me, you know, you're not what I thought an American was all about. So I said to Howe, what do you mean? He couldn't answer it. I said to Howe, how would you have felt if the Americans won the war and you were now, you know, from the north and you were now living in the south and you were controlled by the south? He said to me, well, I have to ask you, how come the Americans didn't win the war? So I said, it was never popular. I said, we never had the backing we needed to win the war, and it would never happen. And so Howe said to me, he actually hugged me. He was in Hanoi when the Americans bombed Hanoi day and night. B-52s came over Hanoi. Nixon was going to bomb them into submission. And he lived underground. And I said to him, did all of your family survive? He said, yes, we did. But he said it was the most horrible time he ever experienced. And he put his hand out and shook my hand. He said, are we friends? I said, yes, we are. And he actually cried. And this is a man who's the same age as I am. He was 54 when I went over there. And I never thought I'd see this. And all the Vietnamese I met said to me that all they want to be is like Americans. Even though they're communists. I said to Howe, I called him a capitalist communist. The reason was, when he pulled money out of his pocket, it was all U.S. money. I'm walking around with the Vietnamese money with Ho Chi Minh on it, and he looked at the money and he was laughing. And I said to Howe, how come you have American money? He says, that's no good, that money. He said, you can get a lot more with American money. So, and they love the fact that Americans are coming back there now. It makes them feel good that the Americans are realizing that the people were not the enemy. And it was just a great experience to go back. The welcome I had there was incredible.
A couple of phrases come to mind to myself as you were speaking is, number one, it was nothing personal with me. I was just going to make somebody else die for their country. And the other thing I would say in closing is, we don't honor wars, but we do honor warriors. Thank you.
All right, do we have any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
One question, do you use mask pants in your hospital, or would they use more out in the field?
What?
Did you use what?
Mask pants.
I can't hear. I lost my hearing because for the first 3 months I was there, the artillery was across the street.
Did you use mask pants in your hospital, or were they used more out in the field hospitals?
Mask?
Pants.
Mask pants. Oh, MASH?
Pants.
Mask
Inflatable pants that they shunt the blood to the...
Oh, right. That was before those.
Okay.
They were more probably in, oh, you know, 10 years ago, 12 years ago. The Gulf War, the first Gulf War, and now the current Iraq War, they use them. Yeah, I think we were in the days of tourniquets. Our supplies, TO&E is called a table of operation. And when we got there, our TO&E was 1945 instead of 1966. So we had glass needles and syringes, and but we found out that in the 25th Infantry Division, the aid stations had disposable intercaps and disposable needles and syringes. So we used to trade. We offered them tetracycline because they believed that tetracycline prevented venereal disease, so we let them believe it. And in turn to get these needles and syringes. Also, when people went on R&R, they would hit up a military hospital in Japan and come back with suitcases full of supplies. We really had to improvise. I don't know if you're familiar with colostomy bags, okay? Colostomy bags are when the ball is brought to the surface because of wounds or disease. Then you had to have a bag for feces to go in. Well, we didn't have these bags, but what we did have was plastic bags that covered IV tubing boxes. And we cut one end of the plastic, slip it out, and then we would make 4 corners on the open end, place it against the skin and use it, adhesive tape, and that was our colostomy bag. We didn't have chest bottles. So at that time we had IV bottles that were made out of glass, and we used those for our chest bottles. One time we had a chest wound that was so large that our operating room staff autoclaved a garden hose, and that was what was used for the chest tube for that particular patient. One other thing I forgot to tell you about is that 30 years later, I found out that Cu Chi was the home of Tunnel City. And underneath Cu Chi was the VC, living in tunnels. And they had a complete hospital underneath. And they did tell us to be very careful. We got, with our meals, we got these little kits. And the kits had a can opener, plastic knife and spoon and fork, and we also drank Coke out of the cans. We were told to be very careful of how we disposed of these things because the VC were not stupid, and when they made their minds, they used these things to put in that mind, so, you know, that would injure our guys. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. I just have to make one comment. I hope I'm not out of line. After hearing all of you speak, whether or not the war was necessary or not, irregardless of that, I think that we all need to keep in mind that lives were lost and there were a great deal of casualties on our side, on the enemy's side, as is true in all wars, even the wars today. Even though some people have political issues, we need to keep in mind that individual families, friends, and relatives are affected by each and every war. And we need to be thankful for all of those servicemen who have come before us, who have given their lives or parts of their bodies so that we can live in a free America and stay out of the political spectrum, and thank you all for what you have done for us.
This gentleman back here made a statement about we fought on the wrong side, and that's his opinion. And Vietnam veterans have had different opinions since back when I first met Pat Finnegan back in 1979. Seems like 100 years ago. And we went nose to nose, had a lot of arguments about Vietnam and about whether it was right or wrong over a beer. And how many times, Pat? A lot of times, right?
A lot of times.
And I don't know if we say we fought on the wrong side. I know I met a lot of guys, a lot of Vietnamese that came here after the war. 1975, when the fall of Saigon, and all these South Vietnamese were put in these camps, and they were tortured and suffered. And these guys came back, and we met them, Charlie's met them, Bobby's met them. And I tell you one thing, they were happy we were there fighting for them, because they hated communism. They despised communism, and they were happy we were there fighting for them. And I can see the gentleman, he left. And now I don't want to get an argument, but there's no way I feel, and I don't know these guys feel, we fought on the wrong side. We fought for what we believed in. We were brought up in a generation, talk about Kennedy, you talk about our fathers fought in World War II, a lot of them. Pat's lost his brother in Vietnam. So Pat has, he lost a brother in Vietnam. So he has a different, different outlook. I lost a lot of friends in Vietnam. But I don't believe we fought on the wrong side. We went over there, we fought a war, and our hands were tied. Our hands were tied from day one. I was there in 1967. Charlie was there in 1963. He's a couple years older than me. But he served 3 tours of Vietnam. He saw Vietnam 3 different times, and probably every time he was there, he saw a different part of what the war was like. So he's got a different perspective than I had, and than what Bobby had. But to say we fought on the wrong side, I don't buy it. We should have fought on the other side, and why? And raised that communist flag over here instead of that flag. I'm proud I served my country. I'm proud of my country, and I'll defend it till the death today, if I have to. So, I'm not in favor of what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, but I defend the troops, and I defend my country. War is what they call a necessary evil. We've been in war for years and years and years. You're not going to go to Vietnam and beat those people. Those people were fighting for 1,000,000 years. They beat the Chinese, the Japanese, they beat everybody. We left. And I think if we stayed there and fought the war like we should have fought the war, we would have won. If there was a winner or a loser. But people that serve their country are proud they serve their country. The gentleman here is a man of the cloth now. He was in Vietnam dropping bombs. And now he's here and he's preaching. So and you heard his attitude about the war. So everybody has a different feeling and a different way to present themselves. And I don't want you going away thinking, Pat and I said I tell you, we hated each other. And I can tell you that now, and he'll tell you, we hated each other. Every time we saw each other, we wanted to beat the hell out of each other. And we're both Vietnam veterans, but we had different outlooks on what we did.
We did it twice a month for years.
Twice a month for years, the meetings, we punched the hell out of each other. But, I tell you what, he did something that Agent Orange talked about. He was probably the most knowledgeable guy I ever knew about Agent Orange. And he fought hard for that Agent Orange and what it was doing to guys. So, with that, I said I would have, get a discussion with the gentleman from the 4th Infantry Division and Marines and Army always fight, and the Marines always come out on top, but I just wanted to get that out.
Could I ask this young lady first, ma'am?
Do you think it's possible for the U.S. government to go into a country that isn't on the same economic level and be able to implement a democracy? Because, I mean, it doesn't, from what I've seen, it doesn't generally work.
You can't enforce democracy. You can't make people be democratic. I mean, America's history of democracy, it's still evolving. Our latest elections show that there's, you know, everybody should be on the page. We don't have a democracy ourselves. What you have is a representative republic. You know, if you had a democracy, you'd be voting on everything. Now, you vote for somebody who then goes and does what he does, hopefully what he wants you to do. But, I don't know how you're going to enforce democracy. As far as winning the war was not winnable. It was from a simple logistic point of view. At the peak of America's involvement, we had 570,000 people there. If you take the standard ratio of 10 to 1, meaning 10 in the rear to put 1 in the field, you got no more than 60,000 guys on the ground doing battle against an indigenous force of 1.5 million in their own country, dug into all sorts of tunnels, not just Cochise, but everywhere they had tunnels. And they've been fighting, like Joe said, they've been fighting forever. I don't know that we fought on the wrong side. He's more to the left than me, that man. But,
That's hard to believe.
that is. But we maybe didn't have to do it at all. You know, if there wasn't so much paranoia at the end of World War II with the red baiting, Roosevelt said, we're not fighting this war so you people can go and recolonize your countries. At the end of World War II, and then Roosevelt died, unfortunately, and what happened. At the end of World War II, they rearmed the Japanese to hold Vietnam away from the Vietnamese until the English could get there to take it from the Japanese to turn it back over to the French, and then the French were off and running with their rubber plantations. And you know, you want to read about what France did there, and then, you know, we came along and we were picking up their tab from talking about Korea and World War. Korea, I don't know if that happened, but that's happening up north at the same time that the French are. There are two different aspects of the same war between East and West. The Americans and the Koreans are fighting up here, and the French and the Vietnamese are fighting down there. And the Vietnamese did not want to be colonized. Talking about 95%, yeah, it was 95% Buddhist country. If we had stood as a country, America, and apologized for Vietnam to the world community, who all knew it was wrong, we get a myopic, slanted view here, but we wouldn't be in the situation we're in now. We were back in a 5% Catholic minority in Vietnam against a 95% Buddhist population. If you're talking about an invasion from the north, yes, that invasion from the north happened after 1954 when the French got kicked out and they cut the country in half, and all the North Vietnamese Catholics that were in position and power from sucking up to the French, and I'm not blaming them. I'm Irish. We got colonized ourselves by the Anglicans. But people change religion to better their lives. Vietnamese jumped from Buddhism to Catholicism to make their life better. When we cut the country in half, all those entrenched French Catholic bureaucrats came south. And that's the Diem brothers. And there's your invasion from the north. They were put in positions of province chief. The southern people said, what the hell's going on here? They didn't know what was going on. There was supposed to be an election in '56, and the whole country was going to vote. Ho Chi Minh was going to win. Everybody knew it. They canceled the election. The first guy they put in charge was a name by the name of Bui Diem. He was one of the leftover aristocrats. He didn't even think in Vietnamese. He'd been living in Paris his whole life. He wrote his speeches in French, and then they had to translate it into Vietnamese. You know, and then we got to go and defend them. From who? Themselves?
Okay, Ned wishes to speak. Ned,
Do I have any time left?
Yes.
I've got
30 seconds.
I've got a meeting in Greenwich at noon. Do you think I'm going to make it?
No.
Okay.
May the Lord be with you.
And speaking as a good Anglican, Irish are all right.
I'm glad
God bless you all.
I'll be very brief, but you see, Vietnam was an individual war. We all have our own stories. I think you've just seen now that if you put more than one Vietnam veteran in the room, they're not going to agree.
You just walked into a VVA meeting from 20 years ago.
So you guys all have your own minds to make up, and you have your own minds as to what you think is right or wrong. And when you can relate to the Afghanistan and Iraq today, and you're going to have to make up your own minds. And maybe back in Vietnam, we didn't have the guts to stand up and speak our mind. We just did what the country told us we should do. And I'm very proud of what I did. And that was my choice. And it's up to you guys now, the new generation. You're going to be the new leaders of this country. And you make up your own minds and you stick with whatever thoughts you have, and don't be afraid to speak up what's right for the government or what's wrong with the government. So you guys are the new leaders. Well, good luck to you.
Let me say one quick thing in closing. In those books I passed out, there was a paper clip. What I was talking, there was an incident, I'm not going to get into that, you can read about it farther, called My Lie, and a man by the name of William Calley. And what those paper clips show, and this is just for you guys as students, and especially in history, you got to read a lot. You got to read all different points of view. Because each one of those books says what the final sentence that happened to William Calley was. None of them are lying, but they're not all telling the truth except for one. And, you know, see, that's what I'm getting at. Just don't count on one source, because like Dad said, you're reading this guy's point of view, you know, and then you read another source, and it's another, you got to get a few different points of views before you make decisions on some major issues. And it is going to be your world, guys. Start reading. As much as you hate it, and I know they make it boring, start reading.
Okay, Bob wants to say one thing and it's over.
Well, first I just want to thank you guys for coming, and maybe something that you heard today from these gentlemen, Charlie, Joe, you know, Helen, especially Helen. You might think about Memorial Day or Veterans Day a little bit differently than you have before, that is about a sale or something. And think about the families that, unfortunately, when you see the newspapers, there are a lot of topical things, okay? And with veterans, when they're killed in war, maybe on the back page sometime in a little sentence you might see something. But think about the repercussions to their families. Or God forbid if they're a prisoner of war, missing in action. Those families never have closure. But all the moms and dads who've lost sons become gold star parents. Okay? And think about them sometimes when you're reading the paper. And think about them during Memorial Day, or, you know, Veterans Day. Thanks.
If you would, just leave the books on the chair or put them over there, please, on that little alcove.
One thing with you, there's a quote, I hate to quote Richard Nixon, but there is a quote that I read from Nixon that he once said that a democracy doesn't work in every country and we shouldn't push it on people. So maybe that answers your question a little bit. I'd like to thank all of you for attending. I hope your students, you are taking home something from this. I think one thing you need to take home is history is controversy. You can see that here. And everyone has their own personal opinion of what happened. Ned said that. Each person that was there saw something different and in a different way. And this is what's, I think, important about history in a democracy, is we can have our own point of view of what happened. And this is what makes history so interesting. Maybe some of you don't find it that way, but some of us do. Our perspective on history changes all the time. And I think that's what makes history so exciting in a way. All right, I would like to thank the panelists. I'd like to thank all of you for participating. Oh, another voice.
Sorry, I said it to some of the students out there, but there is a painting out there with the Vietnamese paintings, with the Vietnam paintings, of an operating room scene. That's my hospital. 3 of those people in that painting I know personally. And the artist is Jim Nelson from Kansas. And those works are on display until October.
Okay, well, in conclusion, I'm going to quote from a gentleman we just interviewed recently on the 1st of February in the oral history program, a gentleman named Charles Hunt, who served in Vietnam with the 504th MP unit with the 1st Cav. And he graduated from Greenwich High School. I was hoping he would be here today, but obviously he couldn't attend. He said on the end of his tour, he said, quote, "The irony of Vietnam was there was no one there to greet us when we came back. No bands. It was like we were sneaking back into the country." I'd like to thank all of you for attending, and I'd like to thank the Vietnam veterans for what they did for us. And Jim said I'd like to welcome all of you home. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.